We are back, and we are joined now by Dr. Eviane Leidig, postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University, author of The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization. Eviane, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course. So, the alt-right in particular is central to your book, the way basically that the far right branded itself from 2015, 2016 on. A lot of our viewers are familiar with these characters, but for those who are not, what are the hallmarks of the alt-right's views? What are the characteristics of the movement as you uncovered through your ethnographic research on this front?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say, let's go back. So I started my research for this book in 2019, which was at the time when the alt-right started to dwindle. But the way I think about the alt-right is that I often think about it as the political movement that helped to bolster Trump's election and presidency. And in addition to that, it has a lot of white supremacist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant views. And then that's kind of sort of a continuation of sort of what is the ideology of the extreme right. But I think what made the alt-right quite different, at least at that time, was also just how online it was in terms of we started to see it emerge on forums like 4chan, Reddit even, and then just got a lot more mainstream, right? So now it started to dominate places like Facebook and Twitter, YouTube, etc. And so when we think about the alt-right, in some ways, it kind of disintegrated, sort of, especially after January 6th. But I mean, it's still definitely there in terms of you still have a lot of the same activists who are on social media and sort of helping to still bolster the MAGA crowd. So in some ways it's disintegrated, but it's just sort of revamped in terms of how we might see it today.
Right. And when we talk about the alt-right, we often trace its origins back to Gamergate. And there's so much misogyny inherent in that scandal, which is why your focus on the women of the far right and the alt-right as well is so fascinating. But can you take us to that moment and kind of what Gamergate was, how it branched off into a very online political movement, or how you can see some of the trappings of that extended into the alt-right movement?
Yeah, for sure. So Gamergate erupted in 2014, and it was basically a massive harassment and doxing scandal against a journalist who was writing about gaming forums. And that definitely overlapped with what we would come to see as the political movement surrounding Trump and MAGA more broadly. But you're right in the sense that we tend to think about just these dudes who are chronically online that are part of, the alt-right with its origins in Gamergate. But the thing is, and also when we think about things like Unite the Right at Charlottesville in 2017, right? We also think about, guys wearing khakis, holding torches, saying you will not replace us. But the thing is, I knew that there were women, particularly women YouTubers, who are really big within this scene, but they just weren't getting taken seriously in the same way that the guys of the alt-right were. And I realized, maybe this is a strategic way of presenting themselves, right? Maybe they're choosing not to be as violent or as provocative in what they're saying, because they know that what they're saying still gives legitimacy to the right's ideological agenda, but it often slips under the radar. So that's why I was I need to write a book about women in the far right, because no one's really paying attention to them or taking them seriously.
Yeah. And to bolster what you're saying, I think when most people think of the alt-right, they primarily associate it with white men, right? Because of those images from Charlottesville and things like that. But we know that women have played a role in right-wing movements throughout history. I mean, whether it be Phyllis Schlafly, that's a pretty infamous example here in this country, or obviously other female conservative politicians throughout time. But particularly the way they play a role in this movement is a very online role. So how do these alt-right or far-right female influencers present themselves to their audiences in order to kind of lure them into what they're selling, sometimes literally?
No, you're actually right. They are selling their brand and the movement.
Right.
I mean, a lot of these women started off as political commentators on YouTube or like reacting to current events. And I would think that was definitely the peak around 2016, 2017. But then I've noticed, particularly during COVID, a lot of these women started posting a lot more lifestyle content, like on Instagram. So they started posting about like food vlogging or health and wellness, which really like mutated with the anti-vax, and some of them jumped onto the QAnon conspiracy train as well. And that shift was actually really interesting, right? Because like this election season, I don't see them like outwardly talking about politics that much, at least not like during the 2016 election season. But they're choosing to sort of showcase a really different form of visual propaganda with their content, right? So they're trying to show like what a traditional nuclear family looks like in sort of the everyday like posting of like I'm making dinner with my kids or I'm gardening in the backyard. But it's still really political in terms of like, you know, the message that they're trying to get across and sort of this image of heteronormative families. And that's also why I'm starting to see overlap more with like the Tradwife scene as well, which many people don't think it's very political, but it's actually all about like upholding certain racial and gender and class norms.
Yeah, what is the Tradwife movement? This is one where I kind of have a sense, but I
Yeah.
don't really, I never felt the need to look into it that much.
Yeah, no, I applaud you for that. Yeah, so Tradwife is short for traditional wife, and sort of the idea, and I mean the idea is that you have like stay at home wives, and if you know if they're children to be mothers, and they sort of like retreat back into the domestic sphere, and then the idea is that like their husbands are the primary breadwinners working in public facing jobs. There are very distinctly anti-feminist, and I think this is where you often see a lot of overlap with the far right, in terms of like believing that feminists like dominate and control mainstream society and prohibits women and men from quote unquote exercising like their natural biological femininity and masculinity. But a lot of Tradwife content is this very leisurely, like making sourdough bread or like knitting or crocheting. It's this really more like, you know, slow living and sort of against the girl boss or boss babe of feminism as they would allege it to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I doubt many of these women have read any feminist theory in their lives, but you know, it's this really like reactionary movement against that girl
Would they
boss
be into
attitude.
intersectionality? I mean, I don't like the girl boss feminism either, but
Yeah.
maybe we should send them some bell hooks and they'll be liberated. I mean, I don't know. I did see I've seen some of those videos of like making gum for 5 hours where you could have just made it and bought it at CVS or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting how much does that connect with like Christian influencers? There's a pretty big ecosystem of Christian influencers, and they typically portray heteronormativity as well. Is that a part of this, or is that distinct, or sometimes both?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say those are separate communities, but there's definitely some overlaps, particularly when it comes to like certain influencers who might be like religious as well as promoting a lot of the trad content. But I think, you know, one thing, whether we're looking at like Christian influencers or trad wives or like the extreme right, the one thing that just always unites them is this anti-feminist stance.
Right.
And you know, we also see that in like the manosphere, for example, or people like Andrew Tate.
Yeah, or Tim Pool. We covered this yesterday, where it's funny because societal's ills are feminism's fault, right? In the sense where women are unhappy because they have to work, and so that's the fault of feminism. But also men are unhappy because of feminism, apparently, because they're lonely, and feminism is also making women more independent, but then also they hate that independence. So it's just funny how both men and female unhappiness is really just women's fault in the end of the day.
Yeah, and like that was actually a surprising theme that I found with my research is that I was expecting a lot of these far right women influencers to be radicalizing other women into the movement. But I actually found that, like, at least on YouTube, they had a lot more male followers. I mean, one of them said that she looked at her YouTube analytics and 85% of her viewers were male, which was like pretty astonishing to me, right? So, like, and I think they know that, right? So they're tailoring to that male gaze with that demographic. And, you know, they're talking about things how society doesn't allow men to exercise, natural forms of masculinity because of the feminists, right? So I think they're really adaptable in terms of appealing to both male and female viewers with their content.
I mean, I haven't seen our YouTube analytics, but from my experience, political content is pretty more male dominated, right? But this is not even as expressly political, right? In the sense that it's also about portraying a lifestyle and influencing. Can you talk about the ways that they either directly appeal to a male audience or do so through showing, not telling?
Well, it's sort of both, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like sort of on this like superficial, very visual layer of course, the aesthetic is about like dressing extremely femininely and, participating in, certain household chores and behaviors that sort of show that woman's place should be sort of submissive to the husband in the household. But then when they talk about sort of the anti-feminist stuff, or they talk about like how society is failing men, and I think it depends a bit on like the influencer that you're looking at. Some are a bit more open than others when it comes to talking about like political or even social issues. There it comes across much more in the sense of like, aren't you just lonely and sort of seeking that traditional wife that would sort of give you that happiness and sense of fulfillment? So that's when it veers more into being more explicit about their ideological views.
So, I mean, you put an emphasis on parasocial relationships as also being kind of key here. How do some of these influencers, and if you don't mind actually naming them, I think Lauren Southern, some people may be familiar with, but I'd also include, maybe she's not a part of it exactly, but Chaya Raichik has her own little niche in the right wing movement, but particularly the more influencer type women. How do they attempt to kind of foster these parasocial relationships with their often largely male audience?
Yeah, I mean, so, and also for those who may not be so familiar with this term, like parasocial relationships means that audiences feel like they intimately know and feel close to an influencer or to a content creator. And so I sort of show throughout my research, things about like certain posting behaviors. And I mean, we can go all the way back to like the origins of YouTube in terms of like sort of crowdsourcing suggestions or people leaving comments on videos, like that really interactive and form of like interacting with their followers. But then I think, as a lot of these women started transitioning more to places like Instagram or TikTok, it became a lot more about like posting their everyday lives, things that seem relatively banal to us, but sort of establish this much more like holistic picture of themselves, right? So it's one thing to offer that political commentary. It's another to be like, this is what I'm cooking for dinner. Like, this is like my household chores that I'm doing for the day, right? And it just seems so mundane, but it's also part of just like establishing that sort of everyday relationship with their followers. For people like Lauren Southern, for example, it became a lot of like behind the scenes filming while she was like filming her documentaries or going on tours and giving speeches, right? So like posting a video of herself before she went on Tucker Carlson, being like, join us live, at this time. And I would say like, this was definitely something that's transformed over the last few years, right? So when these women started off, I'd say in like 2015, 2016, like this was still relatively new in terms of like kind of soliciting that type of audience engagement in that way. But then over time, it's just been building so that it's become, I think, just part of like the everyday forms of social media interaction that we see.
Well, I mean, influencing is that, right? Where it's essentially an advertisement and it's non-traditional in the way where you build up that parasocial relationship with your audience on Instagram or TikTok, and then you're selling yourself, you're selling your lifestyle, and eventually you're selling some products and your lifestyle is mixed into there, right? So it's a long game for then being able to capitalize on it financially, and it plays on people's emotions in the way that Don Draper would be very proud. So like what are some of those products that they're pushing? Because I know that some of these female right-wing influencers have relationships with platforms like TPUSA or PragerU.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think monetization is for some of them probably their primary form of income generation, besides things like advertising revenue on YouTube. It's interesting because I started to see this sort of the sponsors that they were partnering with throughout different, let's say, crises. So, for example, during the pandemic and especially at the height of BLM protests, there was one sponsor called My Patriot Supply, which sells like emergency survival kits. So, like 25 years of freeze dried food or water filtration kits, very Alex Jones vibe. Kind of stuff. And this sponsor was sponsoring several different influencers that I was studying at that time. And they were all pushing this, fear-mongering rhetoric about like an upcoming racial civil war in the US because of BLM. So that was one really big sponsor at that time. But then it became a lot of sponsors on stuff like health and wellness products, like skincare or beauty supplies, right? And and again, like when it comes to the influencer space, beauty and wellness bloggers have long worked with corporate sponsors as a form of monetizing. But the messaging here was quite deliberate in terms of like trying to sell both an ideology and a lifestyle. So it speaks back to what you were saying about like creating that personal branding where people tend to, I think, literally consume like identity politics has become commercialized now. People are literally consuming the identity and feeling like they're part of that movement because they're literally buying products into this movement.
Right. So we had somebody write in and say, Lydia Rose says, I'd be curious to hear what the doctor thinks on alt-right trans women such as Blair White and how they fit into this as well. And I guess I brought up Chaya Raichik earlier, but the anti-trans movement also being a part of this as well, and that connecting to reinforcing gender roles as these women tend to do.
I mean, I would say in general, trans representation is pretty marginal. Like you'll find very few folks who are sort of visibly out there in terms of like their trans identity. By and large, it is a deeply transphobic and just broadly anti-LGBTQ movement in general. And I think it's really interesting because in like 2018, 2019, I started to see this anti-trans rhetoric start to escalate amongst these far-right actors in ways that were still considered to be kind of fringe. But of course, now we're seeing like a lot of fear-mongering around trans rhetoric and sort of associations with grooming and with perversion and such, right? But like that's something that used to be pretty fringe and now it's just become so mainstream.
Small D Democrat writes in, our viewers have questions for you. Can you ask her about Pearl and why she's so bad at the alt-right woman grift? What's this psycho's last name? Pearl
Davis. Yeah.
Pearl Davis, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, Pearl. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there's actually quite a lot of Tradwives who don't like Pearl, which is because
she's too inflammatory.
She's too inflammatory, and like she also disses parts of the trad community, right? Because I would say like she's definitely more a female version of somebody like Andrew Tate rather than somebody who's vehemently pushing for traditionalist views, right? Like I think she sticks more to like the anti-feminist stance rather than like say we gotta go back to the 1950s sort of.
Is she even married? Yeah. I mean, she can't be a part of this space if she hasn't been locked down at this point. I mean, what does she even have to say?
Yeah, I don't know if she's married. I think someone should Google that.
Right.
Let us know in the comments. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting that they reject her in that way. I mean, maybe it's just because she's like she's like the Rabbi Shmuley of Zionism, where it's like you're just going on to go on cable hits, but you're not representing our horrible movement well.
She's not married.
Oh, she's not married. There you go. So she can't be a part of the club, I guess. So lastly, before we wrap up here, you also talk about the recruitment into some of these far-right spaces, particularly via these female alt-right influencers. What does that look like, and how can, I guess, people identify if, say, someone in their life is listening to these folks and maybe going down this path?
Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to things like recruitment and radicalization, so I've heard these women talk about so many different strategies that they use, right? So on the one hand, they might be appealing to to young women who are already trad cats, like people who like sort of grew up in conservative religious upbringings, and those are very easy targets for them. But for others, they talk about themselves being quote unquote recovering feminists. So they'll try to target women who might grow up with really progressive views and then sort of start to feel really unhappy with their life situation. Again, talking about, the sort of anti-girl boss mindset. And so for these far-right women, they'll be like, I was like you, I had these really feminist views, but now I'm recovering from that. And like, if you turn to traditionalism, that is your antidote to feminism. So they sell this myth.
And so for men too, what they offer, like you can find a wife like me, kind of.
I would say for men, yeah, it's a lot of like honey trapping. It's definitely a lot of like, if you join our movement, you're going to find a traditional submissive wife. I would say it's pretty superficial in that way. But they also tell young men, like, if you join far right groups, like you can sort of exercise traits of aggression and dominance and leadership, because at the end of the day, these influencers are one of the few female faces of the movement, but by and large, women are pretty invisible when it comes to the far right more broadly, and it's the men that are sort of dominating the top of the hierarchy. So they basically encourage young men to join those movements and be able to exercise that. But yeah, the question about like, how can we spot the signs? Because that's pretty hard. And I'll say that, like, I've been studying the far right for several years, and even there's times where I'm like, is this actually far right? Or is this more just like this trad escapist fantasy content that I'm looking at? And I'll have friends send me videos and ask, like, is she one of those far right women that you've studied? But I think ultimately, despite the fact that we have a lot of like algorithmic amplification of this content, it definitely comes down to, identifying what are people's personal grievances before they turn to hate. Because for a lot of the women I study, they talked about like being red pilled, but then like losing a lot of family and friends after turning towards these radical views, and how painful that was for them, right? So I think that early intervention, if you see someone starting to post some of this red pilling content, just be there and ask questions, right? Like, just be there and be like, okay, like, what's going on? Like, why are you interested in this stuff? And I think just that early intervention, even if it may not be successful at first, it just shows that like people want to feel that they need that consolidation, that they need that attention and validation, right? So I think that's just one really important thing to think about.
All right, truly last question, because Morpheus writes in, and this is actually I am curious about your thoughts on this. Does she have any thoughts on the intersection between anti-feminist Tradwife folks and American Catholicism? It seems like there's a lot of overlap to me. I think that fits into the Harrison Butker speech that we saw a few weeks ago. I'm not sure if you were following that, but.
Yeah, it's not an area that like I'm totally following, but like I have read about some of those overlaps. I would say that actually I've looked a lot more into Mormonism and sort of like the trad anti-feminist content, because actually some of the top Tradwife influencers are Mormon, and it's really good because they rarely talk about religion, they never talk about politics. It's all just really this aesthetic, like, look at my family of 10 kids, So yeah, it's a great question. Thanks for that. But I mean, I think we could go into a loophole around all the different sort of religious communities and how it overlaps with the trad.
Yeah, but I think the Catholicism thing is a little bit more, it's a little newer, right? There's this kind of, it's something emerging maybe that was a little bit past some of the research that you did. But anyway, the book is fascinating. This is tailor-made for our audience. It's called The Women of the Far Right, Social Media Influencers and Online Radicalization. Dr. Eviane Leidig, we will put a link to your book wherever people are listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.